In today's episode, I speak to Maurice Schutgens, who is the Managing Director of Conservation at Space for Giants. Today, we talk about human wildlife conflict and illegal wildlife trade in Africa. We also talk about the role of nature based economies in supporting the conservation of megafauna in Africa. Tune in to learn more about Space for Giants. As always, 30% of the revenue generated from this episode through paid subscriptions on Substack will be donated to conservation projects such as Space for Giants. So, welcome, Maurice, to the podcast. It's a pleasure to have you on today.
Thank you very much. Absolute pleasure to be here.
So, what was the idea behind Space for Giants?
Yeah, so Space for Giants. Space for Giants was set up by our founder, Dr. Max Graham, and the very genesis of the organization dates back to the early days of his master's project and his PhD project. And what it really was about understanding how elephants use space in these increasingly human-dominated landscapes that we're seeing in East Africa. And so Laikipia, where the charity was established, is this 10,000 square kilometer mosaic, and you've got Kenya's second largest population of elephants there. But it's also an increasingly settled area, and you've got about 400, 500,000 people living within this county, and a huge amount of smallholder farmers who cultivate land to carve out an existence. And so you've got these elephants, probably about 3,500 elephants that move through these landscapes. And so, people and elephants come into contact with each other. And so the idea behind Space for Giants was really trying to understand that better and to find solutions to allow for coexistence in this area.
So, Space for Giants is tackling human-elephant conflict in Kenya, Uganda, and Gabon. So, how severe is the conflict in this region, and what factors influence the severity of the conflict in the region?
Yeah, so it's a very good question. Space for Giants started out looking at human-elephant conflict, but since the charity was established, we've branched out into a number of different programs that I'm sure we'll talk about a bit later. But tackling and understanding human-elephant conflict is one of the things we do best. And so when you ask, how severe is conflict, it's very context specific. So East Africa and what we see in Kenya and Uganda is so completely different to what we see in Gabon. So in East Africa, you've got these large landscapes, you've got these increasingly well-defined hard boundaries. And when I talk about a hard boundary, is you've got cultivation land on one side dominated by people, and on the other side, you've got maybe a wildlife conservancy or a national park or some other form of protected area. And there's a very clear delineation in the sand, right? When you talk about Gabon, it's completely opposite. So Gabon, it's a relatively small country. It's a small population, about 2 million people. It's got 95,000 forest elephants. And so what you've got is an ocean of forest, essentially, and these little pockets of humanity dotted around, right? So the context is completely different, right? So in East Africa, when you ask about severity, we collect a lot of data with our partners, the Kenya Wildlife Service and other partners in the landscape. And we can say from our data that since 2018, human-elephant conflict is the leading cause of elephant mortality in northern Kenya, right? So it used to be poaching. And at the height of the poaching crisis, you had 40,000 elephants being killed across the continent. And this was 2012, 2013, 2014. But what we're seeing since 2018, it's human-elephant conflict, actually. And I would hazard a guess that this trend is what you would see in other countries across sub-Saharan Africa in the east and southern areas. In Central Africa, it's most likely still poaching. Now, it's obviously much harder to get an accurate read on what's happening in those areas because of the landscape. But yeah, in Kenya, conflict is extremely severe. And, we have thousands of incidents of crop raiding that happen every year. Livelihoods are being destroyed by elephants. Elephants are, while they are very charismatic on one hand, they're an extremely destructive animal on the other. So, things are really bad. And in Gabon, we see a similar trend where, human-elephant conflict has become completely politicized, right? And while the government has a lot of pro-conservation policies in place, they're being inhibited by the fact that the local population want them to address and come up with solutions to human-elephant conflict. So you see that something like human-elephant conflict is actually dominating the narrative in the political arena. So yeah, human-elephant conflict is severe across Africa.
So in 2016, Space for Giants published a paper titled Fencing Elephants, the Hidden Politics of Wildlife Fencing in Laikipia, Kenya. Talk about this research. Firstly, talk about how fencing can be used to mitigate conflict and some of the drawbacks, and then talk about the publication.
Yeah, so let me start with electric fencing as a human elephant conflict mitigation tool. So I mean, the first thing I would say is that there are no silver bullets, right? There is nothing, no single one intervention that is 100% effective. They just don't exist, right? The interventions you come up with are context specific. An electric fence is not always the solution, right? So there is this great toolbox of different interventions that has been created by Save the Elephants, and you've pulled together all this knowledge and learning about how do you tackle human-elephant conflict. And they've come up with this toolbox of all these different types of interventions, and electric fencing is just one of those types of interventions, right? So generally, when we look at it, you've got on one hand, you've got these farm-based deterrents, which are generally cheap. They can be labor intensive, and they're kind of appropriate at your individual household level. So we're talking about maybe you try like a chili fence or burning some elephant dung briquettes, or maybe you have a watchtower, you have a spotlight, banging some pots and pans, maybe there's some bees, etc., so that you protect your individual household. And they can be effective, right? But what we see is that elephants habituate very quickly, right? They learn what's going to injure them or kill them. And so they get used to these types of interventions, and ultimately they overcome them. And also because farm-based deterrents, they're labor intensive. If you've got a farmer who's in the field for 12 hours a day, I mean, it's very hard for that individual then to spend another 12 hours on a watchtower at night in these cold climates to protect his farm from elephants, right? So you've got the farm-based deterrents. These farm-based deterrents are obviously not appropriate at a landscape level. So in northern Kenya, where we work, the electric fences that we manage, they're over 130, 140 kilometers in length, right? You cannot put beehives for 140 kilometers. You cannot put watchtowers for 140 kilometers. You cannot put fires and have farmers lined up, banging pots and pans for 140 kilometers, right? So you need these landscape level interventions. And this is very quickly where you start looking at, well, it's either fences, electric fences, or trenches, right? And each of these interventions has their positives and their negatives. But what Space for Giants has found is that good fences make really good mitigation measures, right? And when I say good fences, I mean specifically, they have to be well designed, right? So design matters. It's absolutely critical when it comes to elephants. You can't just have any design of fence. It needs to be adapted to elephants. And more interestingly, it has to be adapted to the elephants that we have in Laikipia, which are these increasingly risk-taking elephants who challenge fences on a daily basis, right? So the elephants in Southern Africa are different to these elephants in their experience of dealing with electric fences, right? So well-designed fences, they have to be well-maintained, they have to be checked on a daily basis, the vegetation has to be cut underneath them, they need to be well monitored, you have to check your voltages, and they need to be well policed so that you know that they're not being vandalized, most often by people, right? So you need a very intensive monitoring framework before you have a good fence which could work to prevent elephants from crop raiding. Now, quite often people have a lot of criticism for electric fences, and they say, what are the adverse impacts and why are fences bad? And I think one of the most common misconceptions is that when you put a fence, you're putting a permanent barrier on the ground, right? And people say, okay, well, what you've done now is you've cut a migration route for elephants. And, obviously we look at empirical data, we look at collar data, we talk to people, we look at former range of elephants, etc. We look at water access, we look at all these different variables before you put a fence. You don't just turn up and put a fence, right? So you consider all of these elements. Now, what we see in northern Kenya is what I talked about, is these hard boundaries, right? So on one side, you've got elephant compatible land, and on the other side, you don't, right? So elephants are not migrating through habitat or areas where people are living, right? We find that elephants cooperate a certain distance away from areas where they feel safe, right? But they're not walking through those areas and then coming back. So we're not cutting the migration route at all. So I think quite often people, think that you're doing that when actually you're not. But there could be adverse impacts, right? And you've got to balance those up, right? So things like access to water. So when you've got a boundary, which is a river, for example, where do you put the fence? You put it on one side and limit access to for elephants to water, or if you put it on the other side and then you limit access by people to water, right? So you've got to consider those kind of things. Access to resources. So in northern Kenya, the context is very much, it's a pastoralist landscape as well. So fences are often perceived as a negative thing simply because they prevent access by people to access natural resources on other people's land. And this becomes a very sensitive discussion immediately, right? Because, private land is private land. So are people legitimately allowed to access, grass or firewood or other resources? So it becomes a very complicated discussion, but fences are seen as the negative because they prevent that by default, right? In many ways. And then there's obviously things like risks of, wildlife dying on fences, being trapped, becoming entwined in the electric fencing wires. And that does happen. In Southern Africa, there's a lot of attention for pangolins that get stuck on wires. Up in northern Kenya, it does happen with buffalo sometimes, who get entwined with their horns, sometimes with giraffe and their long legs. So it does happen, but I would say it's relatively rare that you wouldn't say we can't build a fence because it's going to, impact other populations of wildlife. I don't think that would be accurate at all. So having said that, kind of set the scene for electric fences, I suppose the question you asked about this research, right? Now, I didn't do the research. The research was done by Dr. Lauren Evans, and you should speak to her, and she can tell you more about the paper itself. But to give you a little bit of background, so the work we have done in northern Kenya is a county-wide electric fencing strategy. So elephants came onto the Laikipia Plateau in the 60s and 70s and 80s in response to poaching pressure in the north, in Samburu, right? And elephants came onto the Laikipia Plateau, and there was water, there was pasture, and they stayed, right? And numbers began to increase. And so human-elephant conflict started occurring. So then in the 80s, there was a drive to kind of develop some kind of way forward. How do we mitigate this conflict? And in 2002, a county-wide electric fencing strategy was developed. And this strategy was ultimately adopted, and fence construction was started in about 2007, 2008, with support from the county government and private sector, NGOs, etc., and international funders, right? And so what this paper was actually looking at is that the fence was to prevent or reduce human-elephant conflict. But there was a very clear political angle associated with the fence, right? So while it was originally posed as a win-win solution, the fence didn't really look at all the underlying and adverse impacts it could have on the various stakeholders involved in the project, right? And all the stakeholders wanted something else. Private ranchers, they might have wanted to prevent access by local people or pastoralists to their land. Pastoralists saw it as a negative because they would feel their access to resources was limited. You had politicians who were desperate to see the fence constructed so they would be re-elected. You had the NGOs who saw the political support as an opportunity to raise a lot of money for the NGO and the project itself. So everyone had an angle, right? And I think that that's what this paper is about. It was trying to understand the mostly unintended impacts of this fence, which is this physical structure, which took on a completely political nature, right? So it was just a fascinating piece of research that it wasn't as simple as constructing a fence that would protect local people's livelihoods. No, it became completely politicized, and it continues to be politicized in many ways.
So you had briefly spoken about the 140 kilometers of fencing in Kenya. And Space for Giant is also working on smart fencing. So what exactly do you mean by smart elephant fences?
Yeah, so I think What I was referring to is that you need to build a fence that is context specific to what you are trying to which species you are trying to mitigate against, right? So the fences you build for lions and other predators are completely different that you would build for monkeys or for elephants, right? So our smart fences, solar powered fences, firstly, they don't run on mains electricity. They could, of course, but because you're talking about these really remote areas in northern Kenya and the unreliability of the national power grid, you need to be on a solar solution. So the solar fences. The second thing why we say they are smart is that they've been tailored to be effective against specifically elephants and specifically these large bull elephants. So our fences, paradoxically, are small, right? So originally fences started as these really tall fences, 7 foot in height. Today, the fences we construct are about 3 foot above the ground. And fences appear to even be getting lower. You know, other partners in the landscape are building 2.5 foot fences, right? Now, what makes these fences unique is something called outriggers. And these outriggers are these pointy bits of metal that conduct electricity. And they are pointed, they're attached to the top wire, so at about 3 foot in height, and they point outwards at a 45-degree angle. And the point is that as an elephant approaches this fence, they get poked in their chest, in the soft, fleshy part of their chest where it's most uncomfortable for them to get shocked, right? Now, these fences need to have a voltage of a minimum of about 6.5, 7,500 volts. Anything less than that in northern Kenya is no longer really effective against elephants. And that's because, like I said earlier, elephants are starting to habituate to electric fencing, right? And they've been exposed to electric fences for the last 3 decades. So we're talking smart fences in our context, solar fences built to a specific design and monitored with technology, either through Earth Ranger and logging, voltages, fence breakages and things like that, or using technology like perimeter patrol, where you have this kind of live feed of fence performance and voltages that are changing based on what's happening locally on the ground. So that is our context of smart fences in Kenya. In Gabon, it's completely different. In Gabon, we've actually developed a very innovative approach, and that is we use single-strand fences in Gabon. And this is because forest elephants, they have never been exposed to electric fences before, right? So what if we were to take the high specification design from East Africa to Gabon, what you would be doing is speeding up the learning curve of this elephant to overcome that design, right? Because we are locked in an arms race between people and elephants, and we keep developing designs and elephants keep breaking them, right? So in Gabon, we've started with a very simple fence, and we're actually using poly tape and poly wire. So what they use in New Zealand and Europe for, keeping their sheep and goats, etc., and cattle in an enclosure. That's what we're using to prevent crop raiding by elephants in Gabon. And those fences are 95% effective. So really quite unique how the context really matters.
So, talk about how space for giants is contributing to the mitigation of human elephant conflict at a national level. Like, from what I've seen from your website, you guys are also involved with a national level strategic planning.
Yeah, that's correct. I mean, again, it differs by country and where we operate. So our human elephant conflict interventions are in 3 countries. They're Kenya, Uganda, and Gabon, right? And each we do a little bit differently. So in Kenya, what we do is, Space for Giants has collared elephants. We monitor all our fences. We have mobile fence scouts and scouts on motorbikes who collect every single crop raid incident that happens. So all of that data is fed directly through Earth Ranger, is fed directly into the national government and the county government. So our partners, Kenya Wildlife Service, the moment it happens, they get access to that data. And all of this data obviously helps feed into the government being able to understand where human-elephant conflict hotspots are and what is required based on the partners on the ground, the types of interventions, etc. Right? So that's kind of feeding in data into a national framework. So that's what we do in Kenya. And, we've used our expertise and been requested to visit other areas in Kenya and to have a look at what fencing solutions, most importantly, fencing alignments, right? What makes sense, and fencing designs ultimately. So that's how we're helping in Kenya. in Uganda, since 2018, we've actually been helping the government roll out a national fencing strategy. So focused on the key protected areas where they have the majority of the elephants, and those are Queen Elizabeth Conservation Area and Murchison Falls Conservation Area. So those two conservation areas probably have about 6,000 elephants in total. And we have been providing technical expertise since 2018 to help them construct fences on the boundaries of those two conservation areas. And in Gabon, we've actually helped the government of Gabon develop a national strategy to tackle human-elephant conflict, because electric fencing, like I said, they are just one tool, right? And putting the intervention in place is great, but then you've got to monitor it and you've got to start applying an adaptive management framework. So what you start doing after fences stop working, etc. So, in Gabon, we're working at an extremely high level with the government, advising them on a national strategy.
Now let's move on towards the illegal wildlife trade. Talk about some of the work with Space for Giants doing to tackle the illegal wildlife trade across the range you guys are working in.
Yeah, no, happy to do so. I think that things have changed in the last 12 years, and they've changed a lot. So at the height of the poaching crisis, where we were operating in Laikipia, like I mentioned, 35 to 40,000 elephants being killed every year across the continent for their ivory, right? What we saw in our landscape was a tiny snapshot of that, right? And it was 100 elephants were killed in 2012 in this area where we operate. Now, 100 elephants of an estimated population of about 3,500 is not massive, it's not catastrophic, but it was an indicator of a very rapid uptake of poaching occurring in this landscape. So what we did as an organization, we partnered with all the partners in the landscape, both the private and the public sector, and we created this consortium to establish a community policing initiative, right? And what this was focused on was putting in place a very well-trained rapid response unit with access to an intelligence picture to operate in this 10,000 kilometer square landscape to address incidents of poaching or other associated insecurity. So Space for Giants were instrumental in securing funding from the United States Fish and Wildlife Service and other partners to establish this. And this program was so successful that in the space of just 5 years, poaching came down to zero in this landscape. So that was fantastic. But we also realized very quickly that anti-poaching, it's very sexy. People want to put money into it, and that's great. But if you don't have a wildlife legislation which serves as a deterrent, then ultimately you will lose anyway, right? So what we saw back in the early days was that the wildlife law was not serving as a deterrent and fines were very low, right? And so what we did is we started investing in the wildlife law and justice space. And we started developing prosecution toolkits, helping the government reform legislation. And we started focusing on improving prosecutions. We started focusing on consistent sentencing and trial without delay, right? And the purpose of this was to have a much more robust wildlife law and justice framework so that it wasn't just an anti-poaching response. It's an anti-poaching response which was backed up by a very strong legal system. And so, conviction rates have increased into the high 90s now, and this is great from a perspective of the wildlife law operating, right? So what we've seen across where we operate, the illegal wildlife trade has reduced significantly. And I think, there's a huge credit to national governments, to partners, obviously to source countries as well, like China and other areas who've done a lot to crack down on the illegal wildlife trade. So we continue investing in this space because, legislation continually needs to be updated. People need to continually be retrained. So the work is certainly not done, but we've had a huge amount of impact in this space.
So Space for Giants also uses the Smart and Earth Ranger tools. What exactly are these softwares and how do they contribute to the work you guys are doing?
Yeah, it's a good question. So SMART is a spatial monitoring and reporting tool, which has been around for a very long time. And SMART is essentially a data collection and analysis tool, right? So you can collect any type of data, spatial data, right? So this is important. So you have a spatial reference for each data point you collect. And then you can analyze that data and you can create, hotspots, trend maps, whatever you like, right? Earth Ranger is a newer technology to a degree. Previously, it was called the Domain Awareness System, and it's more recently that it has turned into Earth Ranger. And Earth Ranger is a visualization platform and a data integrator, right? So with Earth Ranger, what you have is you have basically a dashboard, a platform on your screen where you might have the map of your protected area, and then any type of integratable data source you can visualize on your screen in real time or near real time, depending on how you collect that data. So if you have a tracked vehicle, you will see it on your screen. If you have collar data, you will see it on your screen. Aircraft, the same. If you have fence voltages coming in from your fences, that comes into your screen as well. So what Earth Ranger allows you to do is allows you to visualize all the information that is coming from a particular protected area or a project or whatever you like. And it improves decision making because you are aware of what assets are where, what information is coming in, and what you need to action next, right? So Earth Ranger is an extremely powerful tool, and we're extremely excited to use it. And so, if you speak specifically about human-elephant conflict, the data we collect are all the spatial data points for crop rates, so we can create these hotspot maps, all the spatial references for fence breakages, so we understand which fences are performing well, which fences are not performing well. We see the elephants, the collared elephant, the collared bull elephants moving across our screen, and we can associate specific crop rates with specific individuals, right? We've obviously got our scouts who are tracked, mobile fence maintenance team that track. We even run a joint Space for Giants Kenya Wildlife Service and mobile rapid response team, right? That every night they're chasing collared elephants away from farms. So what they do is they have Earth Ranger in their vehicle and they see where the elephants are going. And so they try and cut off those elephants before they are able to access farms. So it's a really powerful tool that allows you to be more proactive rather than reactive from a conservation perspective.
Talk about some of the conservation investments which Space for Giants has made.
Yeah, so Space for Giants, I suppose we need to talk about landscapes first when it comes to conservation investment. So landscape, we realized very quickly that the illegal wildlife trade is not going to decide the future of megafauna in Africa. It's going to be a loss of habitat and a loss of space, right? So securing space is now the focus of the organization. But how do you make conservation areas financially sustainable, right? You've got to build a wildlife economy of some sort. And the wildlife economy, traditionally everyone considers just, ecotourism as one type of revenue stream, but the wildlife economy is so much more, right? The wildlife economy is treating our natural resources as these assets that can be either traded or harvested or harnessed in some way. So you've got ecotourism, that's great. You've got payment for ecosystem services. You might have sport hunting, you might have wildlife trading, and now you have carbon, you have biodiversity credits. You have all these different types of wildlife economies that are coming out. So when Space for Giants is looking at conservation investment, we started out initially looking at ecotourism, right? And ecotourism is the most logical, I suppose, from the perspective of a conservation area, right? So a nice protected area has the potential, to offer premium tourism products. And tourism, nature-based tourism is one of the fastest growing sectors in Africa. And it's responsible for, I think it's about 8.5% of GDP and 24 million jobs. So that is huge, right? But when you compare country by country, some countries have really capitalized on ecotourism and others have stayed way behind, right? So what we found is, Kenya is quite saturated when it comes to the ecotourism sector. When you go to Uganda, it's almost a blank slate. There's so much that can be done there, and these protected area network can really be capitalized on. So when we started working with the Uganda Wildlife Authority back in 2017 and 2018, what we did is we jointly developed a prospectus for investment into Uganda's protected area estate. And we said, okay, in this protected area, the following product might work. And in that protected area, such a product might work, right? And so that work actually ultimately led to catalyzing about $55 million worth of investment into the protected area estate, which is an incredible conservation investment as far as we are concerned. But ecotourism is not the only industry or type of wildlife economy. So where we are currently focusing as an organization is looking at the carbon space, like many others, right? And our aim is to develop some high integrity carbon offset schemes on the protected areas where we are currently operating, right? So, we're operating in Pianupe in northeastern Uganda, and this is a protected area which, like many of the 8,800 protected areas across Africa are technically paper parks, right? There's very little there on the ground. So making a protected area like that financially self-sustainable is hard, and ecotourism is not going to do it, right? So you need these diversified income streams, and philanthropy is great, but that's not sustainable. So, we believe that by developing a carbon offset project over PNUP, right, we have the ability to generate quite a significant number of carbon credits, which then could be channeled back into PNUP for the restoration of this protected area. So that's where we're focusing as an organization at the moment. And, the carbon space is moving quickly, and it's not easy. And governments are grappling with developing, voluntary carbon market frameworks and things like that. And we're, as an organization, trying to support that process in the background. But we do believe that there is a significant opportunity here for conservation and for community livelihoods at the same time.
So you were briefly talking about, you briefly had mentioned about hunting also being a one possible stream of the nature-based economy. So what role does trophy hunting have in Africa for conservation?
That's a very, very sensitive question you're asking. I think that Space for Giants as an organization, we are pragmatic, right? We do not believe that ecotourism, for example, can serve the purposes of generating revenue, creating employment, and benefiting local people everywhere. It simply cannot, right? And so, we believe in diversified income streams, and we believe in, as long as it's done ethically and in line with, for example, the IUCN guidelines on, sustainable wildlife utilization, then that is an option on the table. But obviously, people have very strong views about trophy hunting, and people can be very emotional about the subject, which, we understand.
I think once I should have an episode specifically about trophy hunting, because I feel like it's such a complicated issue. So that's.
I think you should, and I have a few suggestions of who you could speak to, who I won't name here. But yeah, I think definitely it is worth a conversation at the very least. And I think what's important is that you look at the empirical data to see, and the context again, right? One thing might not work in another, right? So that's just true.
So what have been some of the most prominent challenges you have faced in your conservation career and at Space for Giants?
Ooh, that is the tough question. I mean, I think right off the bat, I think it's two main things. It's managing expectation and this need, which can be overwhelming, right? So, no matter how much you do and how successful you are in a project, when you look at it in the grand scheme of things, it's always a drop in the ocean, and it's never enough, right? So, it's very interesting. An example is, on one of our projects, we have this 95% efficacy of this electric fencing strategy. And the first thing one of our government partners said, well, what about the other 5%? and it kind of gives you an idea of like, unless it's 100%, it's not good enough. And yet 100% is not achievable, right? And simply because we have put in place, 140 kilometers of fencing, doesn't mean that every farmer sleeps well at night, right? Doesn't mean that every farmer is able to send their children to school, right? It doesn't. And so I think it's sometimes really hard that, trying to stay positive in light of this overwhelming challenge. I find that very difficult, right? Because you always want to do more, but, that comes to another challenge, and that is the finances to do more, right? The conservation space is difficult. We all compete against each other for the same dollar quite often, and there's not enough to go around. So, fundraising is part of the job, and it's hard. And so unless you're finding these sources of, continual income for projects, it's tough to keep them going, right? And quite often funders, they want to fund something new or put their name on something that they have developed, right? Well, actually what you need is financing to keep something which is existing and doing well going, right? So it's really hard sometimes to manage the finances and how you strategically choose what to invest in and what not. And then, there's the element of partnerships. There's a lot of partners in the landscape, but we also compete against each other, right? So the conservation space is crowded, and sometimes, we are our own worst enemy. So we see that as well coming back. And then, of course, there is aligning with politics, right? So you can often catalyze on political opportunities, right? But sometimes, a conservation outcome are only joined for a short period of time with a political kind of support or a political outcome, right? So you've got to manage the politics of government, of conservation as well. So all of these make conservation quite a hard sector, I think, to operate in. Hugely rewarding, but hard, if that makes sense.
And let's go to a more positive note. What have been some of your most memorable moments?
Well, there's been no shortage of those either. I think if I had to pinpoint one, I recall being in Gabon a few years ago, and we had put up this single strand electric fence in the garden. It's actually the pilot. It was actually the first fence we put up in the garden of this elderly lady. And we came back after some time, and she was all smiles. She had the most radiant smile on her face. And that was because she had just harvested crops for the first time in probably quite a few years, because her harvest had been protected from elephants. And and that smile is what you do it for, right? And it's important to remember and focus on the positives as well. You have impacted someone's livelihood. And that's just awesome, right? And so you want to do that again and again and again, right? And scale that up as quickly and as widely as you can. So remembering positives like that is really important.
And how can individuals contribute to Space for Giants?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I mean, just to get the obvious one out of the way immediately is financing. Those that are able and that are capable and that believe in the conservation mission of this charity. We would ask for contributions to continue our important work, right? But we also realize that not everyone is in a position to contribute to an organization, and so the contribution will be different. So that would be at least engaging in the conversation about conservation, rather, right? And I think that from our perspective, especially when we're looking at landscape conservation, it is not enough for just the people living on the boundary of a protected area to care about the protected area. We need to have people, we need to have the banker sitting in Nairobi and the fisherman on Lake Victoria and, the butcher in another village. We need everyone to be engaged and care about conservation and the natural resources that we have collectively. I mean, we are in a climate crisis. Human populations are increasing. We have increasing needs. So, the challenge is going to get bigger. And so we need everyone engaged in this space. So we'd like to think that people would engage on this space and learn more about it and see if they can influence the thinking of others around them as well. And then lastly, I guess, more broadly and more widely, I think, we all have some kind of responsibility, to make, the right consumer choices as well, right? Everything is interconnected. And I think it's really important that we don't forget that, right? I mean, the climate crisis is everywhere, but the brunt of it, will be felt in Africa in many ways, right? Even though Africa, emits but a tiny percentage of the emissions, right? So we want people around the world as well to engage in that, in consumer choices and things like that. So I would say those three things.
So that was the final question I had for you today. Thank you so much for taking time out for this.
No, fantastic. It was an absolute pleasure talking to you. And yeah, thank you for having us.